I got to tell you, I'm really excited, Mr. Brown, because as you know, MadPropsAero has become an international sensation. It's all over. But I was looking at analytics the other day, and this really, I'm enthused by this. Our majority of our viewers come from the United States. Obviously, that's where we are. Number two is Canada. So we've got North America nailed down. But what country do you suppose has viewers who watch for the longest time? I'll bet you'd be surprised.
I'm going to say Australia.
Very close. It's New Zealand.
Really?
Yeah, New Zealand. Not an enormous number of viewers, but then there's not an enormous number of people in New Zealand. But I kind of like that. The shortest, the country with the viewers who watch for the least time, it's France. But I'm going to give them credit because we're not doing this in French.
That may have something to do with it. So some of my best friends are Kiwis, though, so that's okay.
Hey, there's a topic that's been weighing on my mind, and I would really love to cover it with you because there are valid reasons to switch CFIs, essentially to quit your instructor and go to another instructor, maybe even another school.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to talk about some of those things?
I think that we're probably overdue for that, Jamie. I have seen an uptick in social media posts across a variety of platforms with people that are dissatisfied with the progress that they're making. And admittedly, all I'm seeing is one side of the argument, so to speak. But it all seems to point back to the CFI.
Well, and I think there are good reasons. One being, what if you've got a CFI who's perpetually late for your lessons, or they're rushed going from one thing to you, and they just don't have time to deal with you? I think that's a valid reason. Your thoughts?
That's a big red flag. You know, if you think about a typical lesson, it ought to include a pre-flight brief, kind of a review perhaps of what you did last week. And this is assuming you've been flying for a little while anyway, and not just the very first lesson, but a quick review of what you did last week. And before you get in the airplane, a review of what you were told to expect for this week or for this lesson. And it shouldn't be rushed, but it should be adequate to cover whatever it is you're going to do. And frankly, depending on where you are on any particular phase of flight, that pre-flight briefing might be 2 or 3 minutes long, or it might be 20 minutes long, or somewhere in that neighborhood. And then of course you go fly the flight, do the mission, and come back. And every single lesson should include a post-flight debrief. What did you do? One of my favorite questions to ask when we land after a lesson is, how do you think it went?
That's a great question.
Yeah, not just launch into an analysis of the students or learner, I guess we're supposed to call them now, strong points or weak points, but ask, how did it go? How do you think it went? Oftentimes those students will have a tremendous amount of insight into how it went. And oftentimes they're absolutely right. So listen to the student first. And then last, before you let them go, actually two things. One is assign some homework for the next lesson, if it's appropriate for what's coming up. And last but not least, get them on the schedule for the next lesson if you don't already have them booked.
Yeah, I really like that because, the pre-flight brief gets your student in the right headspace. So they're focused on what we're doing today. The post-flight debrief, I think, is really important. And my thing was always, I'm going to critique the things that could have been better or things that maybe the student didn't seem to understand. But I'm also going to compliment you on whatever you did well, because if you just keep giving somebody negative feedback, it's negative feedback. You've got to make them feel like they're making progress, and they probably are making progress, but they need that boost that when they come back from that lesson, maybe drained because they've been working on stalls or turns around a point or something, they need to know they're making progress.
Yeah, I had a boss years and years and years ago, and his philosophy, if he was ever critiquing performance from really anybody, obviously, first of all, do it in private, criticize in private, praise in public. But his philosophy was sweet, sour, sweet. Start off with something positive, get into the thing that might be a little bit less positive, and then end with something positive. And I think that is really excellent advice for anyone who's trying to teach someone something else. Sweet, sour, sweet.
I agree completely. Reason number two for me is a CFI who's bad at record keeping. And I'll tell you why. When I was going through CFI training, I had a CFI who was working with me who never signed my logbook. I'd make the entry and I'd get back to it. And we're like 7, 8 flights in, and I'm thinking, what if he gets a new job or something happens and he's not available? None of this counts without his signature. So I'm a big one on record keeping. How about you?
Yeah, same thing. As a matter of fact, oddly enough, let's see, Friday of last week, I was doing a check ride and we came down to dual cross country logging time for, I don't remember, whatever it was we were doing. I've forgotten what the ride was. And we came across the entry on the cross country and it was logged as dual, but there was no instructor signature there. And so now, fortunately, there was enough cross country time in the logbook with an instructor signature, but not much extra. So, that could have been enough to scuttle the ride right there because the instructor had long since gone to the airlines. So, not getting an instructor signature, a proper logbook endorsement for solo time. If your 90-day solo runs out and the instructor doesn't re-endorse you for that 90-day solo, then that time it doesn't count. Technically it doesn't count against as solo time because you're not authorized to solo. So those are the kind of things that can scuttle a check ride. The other red flag, along with the record keeping, is the instructor that walks in and after saying hello said, "Well, what do you want to do today?"
Yeah.
Or what did we do last week? Any question that's kind of in that general vein, that should be a huge red flag. Using a syllabus, and not just using a syllabus, but keeping track of where the student is in that syllabus is incredibly important. There's probably 100 different ways that an instructor can keep track of what a student's progress is. There are a number of online applications out there, including AOPA's AFTA application, which is excellent. Or it could be just as simple as an Excel spreadsheet on your computer, or a file folder, just like a file folder like this that just has some sort of a checklist or something in there. But got to keep track of where they are. Students should never be put into a position of deciding what it is they're going to do today.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of not just using a syllabus, but making sure the student sees it as well. So when we make entries on it and record how things are going, there's so much involved in flight training, whether you're doing private instrument, commercial, CFI training, whatever. It's really hard for a student to keep it all straight in their head. Yeah. So if I can work with them and show them the syllabus, and maybe when they get frustrated, it's like, hey, but you've gotten all this done and you're competent at this. We've just got these last few things to go. That can kind of bolster their mood and keep them motivated when otherwise they're just confused. They don't know how close to the finish line they are. They just give up.
Yeah, I agree.
How about number 3? And this is true on the ground and in the air. If your CFI seems distracted, if something is on their mind ahead of you and your lesson, that's probably not a great sign.
Yeah, examples of that might be texting someone in the air, or inattention to safety. That would be, those two things in particular would be huge red flags. And I'm sure students could probably come up with another dozen things that an instructor may do that actually distracts them, the student, from the learning process. What's the instructor doing? What's he looking at? Shouldn't he be watching what I'm doing here? Why is he on his phone? Why is he on his phone? Um, and I don't want to make it sound too black and white that there may be a good reason that the instructor is on his or her phone. I saw one example of that the other day, where the instructor takes notes during the flight on his cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, well, that's certainly one way to do it. That way you don't have to carry a pen and paper with you. So, okay. But if it comes across looking like texting, you probably ought to let your student know, look, I take notes on my cell phone so that we have a conversation when we're done. Let them know that up front.
I used to fly for a company where we would occasionally text dispatch. For instance, you're running a little late. It had headwinds on a cross country. And we would just text and say, hey, I'm running 10 minutes late, but we are on our way. But you can tell your student that. So it's not that you're texting or distracted and doing something throughout the lesson that gives them the indication they're less important than something else on the CFI's mind.
Yeah, simple. Hey, Joe, let me text Laura to let her know that I'm going to be about 15 minutes late, or to let the student know that we're going to be a little bit late getting in, or something along that. Perfectly acceptable. Of course, that brings up another issue about time management, but that's another day.
Yeah. Well, number 4 for me, and these are in no particular order,
Yeah.
but we've talked about the Airman certification standard, little
Right.
book that tells you everything. It's basically the whole test, everything you're going to need to know. It's not fair for a CFI to just assume the student will discover that and read it on their own. I really think if your instructor hasn't sat down with you and gone through the ACS and maybe do it routinely throughout your training, that's something that should concern a student.
I did a check ride a while back. It's the only one, excuse me, it's the only one that I can remember in the last 5 or 6 years where an applicant, as a commercial applicant, had a question, and I've talked about this on the channel before, had a question about a particular maneuver, and I said, what does the ACS say? And he kind of looked at me like I had 3 eyes, and it said, you have read the ACS, haven't you? Well, no. I said, you have a copy of the ACS, don't you? You can dig out of your flight bag? Well, no, I don't own a copy of the ACS. All this is going on when we're in the air. Needless to say, that didn't end well. So, yeah, as you said, I mean, that's the Bible. The test is right there. The entire test is right there. And if the instructor hasn't introduced the ACS, certainly within the first, I don't know, 2 or 3 lessons at the very least, I would be a little bit concerned about that for sure.
Yeah, I think that's actually very close to professional malpractice, because the FAA has gone to the trouble of printing out the entire test and the standards and what you're expected to know. If the student has never been exposed to that in a supportive way, where somebody's explaining, well, this is where we are and this is what we're going to do, and hey, you're doing this to ACS standards, so we're making real progress. That's just unfair to the student. They're spending a fair amount of money. They deserve to know how they're doing in the big scheme of things.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Now, the last one for me, number 5, is if your CFI is openly showing frustration or anger or belligerence in the cockpit, you don't need that.
Boy, what a turnoff that is for a student. An angry CFI is an ineffective CFI, and I would even say a dangerous CFI. There's no reason for that. I mean, one of the things that that the new ACS for CFIs talks about, as did the PTS before that, was professionalism, and it is quite specific about things that that shouldn't be happening in the cockpit. such as profanity and things like that. And boy, I'll tell you, sometimes some students can really try your patience. There's no question about that. Jamie, you and I have both been there, where you just about want to kill them, but
Yeah, I may have had a student or two. I might have been a student like that.
But I'll never forget this. This just reminded me. My first flight instructor, I was 16 years old, and my first flight instructor was a retired Marine drill sergeant, and he kind of looked the part, kind of stocky, and kind of just like that. And he had kind of a similar personality, nice as could be, but boy, if he got irritated, you knew it in a heartbeat. And I was just having such a hard time learning how to land that little 150 way back in the day. And after one botched attempt, he started yelling at me, and he just yelled at me for 30 seconds. And of course, this is back in the day where we didn't have headsets. There's no intercom. Back when I was a boy.
There was a lot of yelling.
Yeah, back when I was a boy, walking uphill both ways in the snow into school, way back then, we didn't have an intercom. So so his method of teaching was yelling and yelling louder. So. Which is probably the reason my hearing is where it is today. But so I kind of learned early on that's not realizing what I'm learning, of course, that's really not the most effective way to teach. And so when I did become a CFI, there were a few flight instructors that were really, really awesome instructors, and I tried to take the good from them and remember those that maybe weren't quite so good, and not do the things that those people did. In other words, yelling and using profanity and things like that.
This one hits close to home for me, because I went to a really good flight school where I got most of my tickets, and the instructors would have 4 students, and they would split their time between them. And it was a full-time endeavor for the CFI and for the students. And I was going through CFI training, and I had gotten my double I, but that was my instrument instructor. Mm-hmm. But my instructor, his other 3 students had all busted their initial ride. And we're up flying, working towards my CFI, and he just went nuts. You're 10 feet off your altitude, fix that. And he just went nuts, and he's yelling in the cockpit, and he's punching the yoke, and he's just off the chain. And I'm like, dude, I'm the one who passed. Why are you yelling at me? But I did change CFIs after that flight, because he was just at burnout or frustration or whatever. But that's not my issue. My goal here is to make progress, and I'm not your therapist. I'm your student.
I get it, and you were justified to do what you did.
The bonus one on this, Pat, and I think this one's actually really important. If your CFI isn't making an effort to make this fun, to show you the joy of this, to compliment you on the progress you've made, maybe that's a thing you should think about. Maybe that's something to consider a change, because, flying is fun. It's a challenge, but it's a tremendous joy. And if your instructor is making it just drudgery, if you really don't look forward to your lessons, that's not a great indicator.
Yeah, it takes time. It takes dedication. I think sometimes students walk into the situation, and they may not really realize just how much dedication this really takes. I mean, this is a life and death skill that the student is learning. It's a life and death skill that the instructor is teaching, but at the same time, it ought to be fun. Maybe occasionally you drop in someplace for $100 hamburger, it just as an example, or maybe in some of the early lessons, maybe you take the student to where he or she lives and circle the house and take some pictures from a safe altitude, of course. Those kinds of things can make the difference between keeping someone's interest and not. you know, and there will be plateaus that are going to be encountered along the way. That's when the creativity of the instructor can really go a long way to helping the student get over that plateau, whatever it might be. Landing is certainly a big one.
You know, I think even something as simple as landing at a nearby airport as part of a lesson. You know, it might only be 10 or 15 minutes away by airplane, and we land there. It's someplace the student's never been. And you point out, this would have taken us 40 minutes by car, but it's only 10 or 15 by airplane. And what a beautiful ride. Those are all motivators. And that starts becoming something where that student is like, yeah, there's a reason for this. I'm getting somewhere.
Right. So before we wrap it up, because I suspect we probably will shortly, I want to be careful to say that, you know, we're not really sitting here trying to pick on instructors. Flight instructors have an incredibly difficult job. If anyone thinks that being a CFI is easy, walk in their shoes for a couple of days, and you'll find out very quickly that it is a tough way to make a living. And there are excellent CFIs out there. The majority of CFIs out there are excellent, and they care about what they're doing. But there are some out there that are just looking to build time, and instructing is just one of the things they have to endure for 500 or 600 hours or whatever the number may be before they can go to the airlines. You know, I almost every day I hear, you know, when I ask an applicant a question, you know, what do you plan to do? Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'll flight instruct for a little while. Then I'll go to the airlines. It's just like a rubber stamp. You can hear it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't enjoy being a CFI, you need either learn to enjoy it or don't do it. I mean, that sounds a little bit brutal, but someone who doesn't enjoy being a CFI isn't going to be a good one.
Well, and you know, just as every student is unique, they have their own reasons for wanting to learn to fly, their own motivations, their own concerns. CFIs are human beings too. Even you and I, Pat, actual live human beings with external pressures. You know, maybe you got a letter from the IRS in the mail yesterday, and that's kind of taking you off your game, or the car broke down on the way to work today. You know, there's a difference between a bad day and a consistently unpleasant experience with a CFI. So these are 5 good reasons and a bonus why you might think about changing CFIs, because it's not a sign of being a whiner. If you're not clicking with somebody, you're spending a fair amount of money. It's okay to tell the CFI you want to make a change, or tell the chief instructor, I'd like to move on to somebody else because this just isn't working. You don't have to throw them under the bus. It's just time for me to move on to something else. That's perfectly okay.
Yeah. And, you know, the corollary to that, Jamie, is when is it time for the CFI to fire the student?
Yeah, that happens as well.
And so I suspect maybe that's something we could talk about in a future episode.
So behave yourself out there, folks. Pat, once again, great information. I really appreciate, you know, I didn't know as a student, it's okay to ask for another instructor. And I've had great ones and I've had less than great ones. I'm sure you have too. So thanks, y'all. Appreciate you watching. Click the like button if you would. Leave a comment down below, because you all leave some fantastic comments down on these videos. I really love it, and we actually answer them. And of course, subscribe to the channel, because it's just growing like mad. We're really thrilled about that, and it's so good to have you on board. Mr. Brown, I'm going to have to leave you now and go live my actual life, but let's get back together here and we'll do another one of these on another spectacular topic that will inform our viewers. What do you say?
I'm ready. Adios.
See you next time.